Hello, welcome to the International Knowledgeware Association's webinar on the Knowledgeware Maturity Model. This is an intermediate level webinar, which means that everyone listening should already have a basic understanding of what the Knowledgeware approach is. However, for those that are still new to the approach, we'll go through a quick refresher to get everyone up to speed. The goal for this webinar is to first help you understand where your organization fits on the maturity model and to share how to get to the next level with the Knowledgeware. So I'm going to first introduce the team I have here presenting with me. I'm Brittany Satterfield, the IKAA Board Secretary. I like to call myself a Knowledgeware enthusiast. I've adopted the Knowledgeware approach throughout my planning process of the annual Knowledgeware conference and throughout my marketing efforts. Presenting with me is Greg Burrick. Greg is a member of the IKAA with over 44 years of engineering and program management experience, optimizing business production, and engineering efficiencies through the integration of business processes and information technology. And finally, Steve Boisbert. Steve is a Knowledgeware consultant with over 17 years of engineering, program, and knowledge management experience. Steve develops and implements the Knowledgeware approach within organizations through advanced consulting and training. Throughout the webinar, we'll first introduce the Knowledgeware approach. Next, we'll break down the Knowledgeware maturity model, then talk about how technology influences a cultural shift in the use of Knowledgeware. Following that, we'll have time for Q&A, where you'll have the opportunity to ask the presenters questions. And finally, we'll share some free resources to help you and your organization progress with the Knowledgeware approach. And I want to quickly let you know that if you don't have to wait until the end of the presentation to ask your questions. As questions come up, you can type them in the chat box on your screen and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And before I pass it off to Greg and Steve, I want to quickly introduce the International Knowledgeware Association, or the IKAA, to those who are hearing about us for the first time. The IKAA is a nonprofit organization founded on the premise that there is transformative value in unlocking enterprise knowledge. We have a mission to assist individuals and organizations in transforming through knowledge-aware concepts. This very webinar and the annual Knowledgeware conference are just some of the efforts we undertake to pursue that mission. I'll share more about the IKAA at the end of the webinar shortly. So now I'm going to pass it off to Steve to give you a very brief background on the Knowledgeware approach.
Thanks, Brittany. So for all of you that are listening, real quickly, the Knowledgeware approach is a fundamentally new approach to managing technical knowledge. Basically what it does is replace the traditional passive reference shelf model, like you can see in the picture shown on this slide, with a more integrated active knowledge system that puts knowledge in the flow of work, where it can influence technical decisions and analysis. So organizations that use the Knowledgeware approach, they don't have to sift through document repositories and databases hoping to find something that's useful, but instead knowledge is provisioned directly into workflows, giving employees exactly what they need, when and where they need it. So in the previous webinar, Knowledgeware was described as the difference between using paper maps to provide directions on where you're going versus a GPS navigation, where information is automatically provided to you based on the context of where you are and where you're going. Changes in directions prompt automatic course correction in real time, and the route that you've taken is tracked and stored for future reference. So a quick refresher on how this all works. So instead of using documents as the method for conveying knowledge, the Knowledgeware approach uses purpose-built encapsulations of active knowledge called knowledge packets. The knowledge packets are structured, granular units of know-how that are specifically designed for reuse. The knowledge packets get collected and provisioned into workflows by the use of something called an assessment control. The assessment control is the mechanism that collects all relevant knowledge packets needed for a specific workflow or task, and it's also the way knowledge is delivered to the end consumer. The assessment control continuously looks for new or modified knowledge that needs to be provisioned to the end consumer, and it tracks the end consumer's usage and evaluation of the knowledge. So kind of going back to that map metaphor, the knowledge packets are like the directions, and the assessment control is like the GPS navigation unit that relays those directions to the driver. So hopefully all that makes sense. So in short, I think the most important takeaway about the Knowledgeware approach is that what it really does is convert passive knowledge into active knowledge. So with that, I'm going to hand my controls over to Greg, and he's going to explain the Knowledgeware maturity model.
Thanks, Steve. First of all, I'd like to remind everyone to use the chat feature of the webinar to submit any questions that might come to mind during my presentation. Questions will be answered near the end of the webinar. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of what a maturity model is, such as the capability maturity model, the testing maturity model, or the software development maturity model. These are all instruments that are used to measure an organization's level of process formality in a certain discipline, ranging from ad hoc practices to formally defined steps, and then ultimately to process optimization. Besides measuring your organization's process status, the maturity model also helps you identify where there may be areas that require improvement. I think it's important to note that although evaluating your organization against a maturity model is somewhat subjective, it still provides a structure on which you can evaluate and advance in a particular area. So the Knowledge-Aware Maturity Model was developed to assess an organization's level of maturity regarding its management and use of corporate memory. It consists of three important components. First, along the left-hand side are four key organizational features. Each of these features is a group of related processes and elements that are key to integrating knowledge-aware processes within your organization. Next, across the top are the 5 maturity levels. Maturity relates to the degree of formality and optimization of related processes, again ranging from ad hoc to formally defined steps to active optimization of the processes. By assessing the maturity of different aspects of knowledge-aware, it becomes clear where strengths and weaknesses are and where improvements are needed. Keep in mind, however, that an organization's level of maturity is probably not going to be linear. By that I mean that you may observe that you're at a different level for each of the different organizational features. And then finally, along the bottom is the active versus passive knowledge index. A central theme of knowledge-aware is ensuring that corporate knowledge is active rather than passive in both knowledge delivery and knowledge structure. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. So first, let's talk about the key organizational features. First, the scope of enterprise engagement addresses the presence of knowledge-aware across the enterprise. This can be assessed based on the existence of communities of practice and whether their influence is local or enterprise-wide. Next, knowledge capture addresses the commitment and the ability to capture, retain, and validate your technical memory. It helps measure whether the main focus is managing knowledge, with knowledge reuse only an afterthought, or is the knowledge structured with a focus on actively provisioning it? Knowledge provisioning addresses the organization's processes to consistently allocate technical memory when and where it's needed, and to assess its application within your everyday workflow. The organizational demand and health features address the level of both ongoing leadership and bottom-up demand. Both of these are essential to implementing knowledge-aware. So across the top are the 5 maturity levels. At level 0, or lagging, there's essentially no organized level of managing or utilizing corporate technical memory. Its application is purely happenstance. Processes related to knowledge management are usually undocumented and strictly local in nature. As a result, they're dependent on individuals and tribal knowledge, and they remain in a state of dynamic change which results in an uncontrolled environment. The next level is level 1, which is termed forming. At this level, there's really no initial recognition of the need. There is an initial recognition of the need for managing and utilizing corporate technical memory. However, it's still at the local level. But there is a broader effort to experiment and apply structure that would address ownership and broader structure of the knowledge. The concept of formally assessing its application might be attempted, but those processes at this level still lack formalization. Level 2 is titled Expanding. At this level, there's some process stability for provisioning knowledge, and to some extent, there's also processes that extend across disciplines and organizations. Some metrics related to the vitality and application of technical memory exist, helping to improve program performance. So the processes at this level are now becoming more standard and repeatable. Level 3 is strategic. At this level, there's corporate commitment throughout the organization. Knowledge management is no longer considered a process of its own, but rather it's integrated right within the organization's daily processes. It's simply how the work gets done. This integration of Knowledgeware ensures a closed-loop learning process that extends across the organization. And then finally, level 4 is titled Extended Strategic. So at this level, the corporate commitment and application of Knowledgeware extends beyond the traditional borders or boundaries of the enterprise. Bidirectional knowledge sharing with the supply base advances a closed-loop learning cycle. Decision assessment and decision support exist across the value chain. So the active versus passive knowledge index addresses how well an organization has implemented processes that drive active knowledge delivery and active knowledge structure. Active knowledge delivery really means that the knowledge is actively delivered to the knowledge consumer rather than requiring the individual to search for the knowledge online in files or in hard copy. The active knowledge structure refers to the fact that the knowledge is captured so that it is intrinsically active and that its application is direct and unambiguous. There's little or no need for the consumer of that knowledge to interpret the meaning of the technical memory and how it needs to be applied. As an organization moves to the right, there is a recognition that knowledge usage rather than knowledge management is the main objective. So now let's look a little closer at each of the organizational features. At the low end of the scale of enterprise engagement, an organization has little or no recognition of communities of practice. As the organization matures, communities of practice start to be established in different areas, growing from a single community to multiple communities, eventually covering a significant footprint and achieving the strategic level. Beyond this, an organization may extend the impact of the communities by exchanging and sharing knowledge with partners and the supply chain. The next organizational feature is knowledge capture. At level 0, there's no formal recognition of active knowledge or knowledge packets. Any captured knowledge exists in an ad hoc repository or documents with no real strategy for ensuring the application of that knowledge. As Knowledgeware becomes to take hold, the organization converts its ad hoc knowledge into active knowledge packets. Then at the next level, knowledge packages actually start to be generated directly from operations, and knowledge is beginning to be modeled as executable knowledge packets. Then at the strategic level, there's a network of knowledge packets that extend across the organization, providing a single gold source for standards and learnings. The extended strategies level is achieved when knowledge packets are exchanged with the supply chain. Next, the provisioning of knowledge across the organization is the next measurement of Knowledgeware maturity. At the lower end, there's no real effort to ensure the knowledge is allocated into the workflows. Knowledge is viewed as passive, and its application is strictly dependent upon the knowledge consumer to initiate the search for what they might need. At the forming level, there are small pockets of the organization that are beginning to experiment with the provisioning of knowledge through knowledge packets. The next step is to begin integrating assessments to collect and deliver knowledge packets into workflows. At the strategic level, assessments are used across all phases of engineering, even integrating them into modeling environments. In essence, Knowledgeware again becomes the way business is done. This way of doing business can extend to the supply chain, optimizing verification and decision support across the entire value chain. Organizational support and demand play an important role in the adaptation of knowledge-aware. At the lagging level, what knowledge is documented lacks any organizational support for quality control. The growth of knowledge-aware typically begins with a local advocate providing leadership to advance its concepts. As the benefits of knowledge-aware begin to become more apparent, bottom-up demand starts to grow, making the organization less dependent on leadership-led growth. Eventually, at the strategic level, the benefits drive increasing levels of demand. Closed-loop learning and continuous knowledge sharing become a durable capability. Then finally, at level 4, exposure of these benefits to the supply base results in bottom-up demand from that extended enterprise. So hopefully this review gave you some insight into how you can use a knowledge-aware maturity model to evaluate just where you are at in terms of implementing the knowledge-aware approach within your organization. Now I'm going to hand it back to Steve, who's going to talk to you about how you might assess your organization.
Thanks, Greg. I personally think that's a very informative and useful tool. I imagine some of you listening today may want to assess where your organization is in terms of the knowledge-aware maturity model. The assessments are great drivers to get action items to work on to improve your level. So one thing about the assessments, though, is that they do require a great deal of reflection. Often, I would say more accurate assessments of where your organization is in terms of this maturity model are done by the use of consultants. And the reason I say that is because typically consultants have an unbiased opinion of your organization, and consultants don't have to deal with any backlash of any workplace criticisms that may occur when we assess where your organization is. However, if you like to do a self-assessment, you can start with a self-assessment through the IKAA form. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brittany, but I believe you're going to send out a link to the form by email after this webinar?
Yes, that is correct, Steve.
So since today's focus was on the maturity model, I'd like to discuss how technology influences a cultural shift. Undoubtedly, some of you listening to this webinar are thinking that there's no way for your organization to reap the benefits of becoming knowledge aware because the current culture within your organization is too resistant to disruptive changes. And this is a valid concern because culture is the most important enabler of a knowledge aware transformation. Without people, the tools to enable knowledge aware will not make any difference. So that being said, how can technology aid in the cultural shift of an organization to want to become knowledge aware? As we all know, the digital revolution is occurring. If we think back to a not so distant past, basic workflows of today were also previously resisted. For example, CAD design. Rooms full of designers working at drafting boards, expertly crafting designs using penciled lines on Mylar used to be how design work was done. And when that CAD technology first came out, designers resisted using it for many different reasons. But ultimately, that technology changed the culture, and now it's unheard of to use Mylar designs for product development. Beyond that, we see the impact of technology on our culture everywhere we look. Cell phones, social media, smart electronics, we even have self-driving cars. All of these compelling technologies have come to be and have changed the culture. In order for a knowledge-aware technology to change the culture, I believe that there are criteria that it must incorporate. First, before an organization can embrace a disruptive technology, there needs to be a clear understanding of the value that can be unlocked due to the use of the technology. So going back to my CAD example, efficiency, accuracy, repeatability were clear benefits of using the CAD technologies. Once the culture believed in that value, it was able to adapt to the disruption and begin reaping the benefits provided by the technology. Now, I believe the same is true for a knowledge-aware approach. The prevention of recurring mistakes, increased efficiency of users, reduced variation across the organization are all benefits that organizations will want to unlock. Now, the trouble is that in order to unlock these benefits, there are going to be cultural roadblocks that organizations will need to get past to get to the value that the knowledge-aware technology provides. Now, with an understanding of the value, I believe there must be a clear concept to achieve the value. Now, the concept for the knowledge-aware technology is fairly simple. Create a technology that can actively deliver knowledge when and where it's needed. It must be adaptive enough to support workflows from all areas within an organization, and it must also be connected to systems that support the organization. Now, although this concept is quite simple, the development of a technology to meet these criteria, it requires a much deeper understanding of how knowledge should be captured, structured, utilized, and revised. And this deep understanding forms the framework for the knowledge-aware approach and is the basis that the knowledge-aware technologies are built on. In order for the knowledge-aware approach to work, actionable knowledge must be made explicit, structured, and stored for reuse. And this is where the current document-based technologies begin to fail. But those technologies are great for storage of explicit knowledge, but they do a poor job of structuring it in a way that's ready for reuse within the flow of work. So this was the need and driver for the two main components of the knowledge-aware approach, the knowledge packet and the assessment control. And these two components were discussed in detail in the previous webinar, the knowledge-aware primer. So I'm not going to get into too much further detail in describing their benefits, but together these components are the framework that allow organizations to unlock the value of the knowledge-aware approach. So with that, how do these components drive that cultural shift in due to technology that I talked about? Well, those knowledge-aware technologies that provide value, support the concept, meet the criteria of the framework, they're not a thing in the future. The technology to actively provision knowledge into the flow of work exists. In fact, there are several organizations using the knowledge-aware approach in a variety of workflows now. And some organizations adopted these technologies by using commercial software, and others built their own homegrown solutions. So as most of you listening are aware, Oris Knowledge Systems is a commercially available solution that is built upon the technologies and methodology of the knowledge-aware approach and has several customers that are reaping the benefits of the approach. But in terms of homegrown solutions, just this year I visited two organizations that created their own knowledge-aware solution on their own. And one organization started the development of their solution 10 years ago. And it started out as a small project to capture simulation work procedures. And since then, it has grown across their organization, and it's now used to collect and provision knowledge for several domains and several different workflows. Now, the other implementation I saw this year was in its early stages, but the group was using a knowledge-aware approach to create granular, modular, and actionable design specifications that could be provisioned into several workflows, and they're even provisioning it into their PLM system. But what I think is interesting here is that all three organizations created a knowledge-aware solution independent of each other. But they all arrived at the same solution on how knowledge should be made active and provisioned into existing workflows. And I personally found this to be very validating of the knowledge-aware methodology. But regardless of how the technology is developed, commercially or homegrown, as more and more implementations occur and benefits are realized and displayed, I believe a cultural reaction to these technologies will transform from one of resistance to one of expectation. So with that, if there's any questions in regards to the contents I've discussed during this webinar, again, please feel free to use the chat section and send me your questions. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Brittany.
All right, thanks, Steve. So one thing that you mentioned that I really liked was the fact that you can build out your own knowledge-aware system. But there are technologies out there like Oros, which really help speed up the adoption within the organization. All right, so let's move on to Q&A. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box on your screen. For now, we're going to start by first answering the questions that were asked earlier in the presentation. First question, is it possible to get the extended strategic level? Steve, do you want to answer this one?
Great. Do you want it, Greg, or do you want me? I can go ahead. All right, I'll answer it. So the extended strategic level, can you get there? I believe yes. And although I'm aware of some of our current customers trying to achieve that level, and maybe they're doing it on a small scale, Greg and I are also working on a project currently that addresses the extended strategic level. And some specifics on this particular project, we're working with, this happens to be in shipbuilding, but we're working with a regulatory body that creates rules for shipbuilding, and they distribute those rules to shipyards in the form of PDF downloads and such. So the shipyards take those rules and make copies and paste them into all sorts of different files and do a bunch of stuff and work with them. But what we're working on is a distribution mechanism where that regulatory body will create knowledge packets, and they'll distribute those knowledge packets back to the shipyards. So those shipyards will consume those rules inside of assessment controls like I talked about earlier. And the cool thing is, when the shipyards have conformance to those rules, that conformance will be distributed back to that regulatory body along with any evidence needed for compliance. So I think the real benefit to this type of knowledge delivery is that the regulatory body that creates these rules, they're still going to create and maintain those rules, but they're only going to push the newer modified rules to the subscribing shipyards. So although we're still in the very early phases of this project, I believe that this project may be the foundation for really achieving that extended strategic approach for other organizations to utilize and use it as an example.
All right, thanks, Steve. Here's another one. Where do you see knowledge-aware technologies in the future?
You want me to do that one too?
Go ahead,
Go
Steve.
for
All
it.
right, I'll do that.
You're on a roll.
Well, another good question. I'm not sure I can really predict where Knowledgeware will be in the future or the technologies for Knowledgeware will be in the future. I do think, though, that there's a ton of advancements being made in technologies that support Knowledgeware, like augmented reality, artificial intelligence, machine learning, business analytics, mobile technologies. So all of these improvements are going to have some sort of impact on where Knowledgeware goes in the future. I do believe that it's going to be, the future is going to make Knowledgeware even more highly automated, extremely precise. I'm not sure if even going back to my CAD example, if the people that developed the CAD technology knew that by creating those CAD models, they would be able to use those CAD models for virtual simulations instead of physical tests. Or those models might be the basis for additive manufacturing. I'm not sure, I guess, where we're going to go with Knowledgeware. Maybe one of the limiting factors in the advancement of Knowledgeware might be just how much information we can actually consume as humans.
All right, we have.
Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Steve. So we have real quick time for one more quick question. Greg?
Okay, this one just came in. The question is how you can you explain further what is meant by knowledge packets are generated directly from operations? So this is something I referred to in the maturity model discussion. As I mentioned, initially, with regards to knowledge packets, they're generated from existing documents and existing pockets of knowledge that may exist in an organization. Generating directly from operations is the fact that as you move through your operations and you're performing and applying knowledge packets, you're learning more about how they impact your business, the compliance to those, maybe issues or deviations that are required. That information is then brought back in from operations and can then be used to generate or improve the existing knowledge packets. In fact, with regards to ORS, we're going to be having an enhancement coming, I believe, in the next release that will allow a knowledge consumer to convert an issue that may have been generated directly into a knowledge packet.
Yeah, so maybe a lessons learned issue,
Right.
A resolution to that lessons learned issue may be converted into a knowledge packet. Good question.
All right, I see that there are a ton of questions that came in on the chat box. However, we are out of time for the chat questions. So we will take note of these questions and we'll email you back and we'll get back to you as soon as we can on those. Real quick, if you haven't explored the IKAA's resources already on our website, make sure to check them out. There's plenty of resources on there, from an executive overview of the Knowledgeware approach down to 10 tenets, failure modes, and document-centric approaches. All that's available on knowledge-aware.org. And if you want a deeper access to some of the things that IKAA offers, consider joining as a member of the IKAA. As you can see here, we do have annual membership costs, but for now until the end of the year, you can join as a member for free. Yeah, so for free, join now until December 31st. I'll be emailing more information on that later on, and you can also find information on that at knowledge-aware.org. And one final note before you sign off, when you sign out, you will be directed to a short survey. Please take 1 minute of your time to give us your feedback. Your feedback will help us continue to improve every single time, so we would really appreciate it. But that's all we had time for now. We hope you're able to learn something new in today's webinar. So you know I'll be sending out the recorded copy of the webinar, links to the resources mentioned earlier later on this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at info@knowledge-aware.org or reach us out at knowledgeaware.org. Thanks for coming again, and we hope to see you again next time.